All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. So I'm going to kind of get started, I guess, because we've got a lot to chat about. So welcome, Courtney.
Hello.
Thank you so much for doing this tonight.
Thank you.
I'm excited to talk to you, excited to talk about everyone's favorite topic, prices.
Oh, yes.
So for those who are joining in and aren't familiar with me, my name is Kristina Urquhart. I am the publisher of The Vintage Seeker. It's an online magazine that I founded for vintage dealers, for thrifters, for lovers of vintage. And basically, I show consumers where to find cool stuff. I introduce them to the world of vintage reselling and kind of educate them about the sector. And I help sellers like Courtney to reach more customers. Courtney is part of the Vintage Sellers Community, which is a membership that I run. So we've gotten to know each other fairly well through that. And we were chatting about this. And Courtney actually recently had a podcast. She's the host of Conversations in a Vintage Shop. And she recently had a podcast on this topic, on vintage versus thrift and thrift shop prices. So we're kind of going to bring it to Instagram tonight. So Courtney, welcome.
Thank you.
If you want to just give a quick intro and let everybody know who you are.
Yes, my name is Courtney Sharon. I own Carmine and Hayworth Vintage in Fargo, North Dakota, here in the United States. And I have a brick and mortar shop as well as an e-commerce shop. And I live and breathe vintage, and I'm just really excited to spend a night talking about it.
Yes, now that you closed your shop for the day. So.
Exactly.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. So we're doing this live because we love vintage. We want to talk about it. We want to hear from you as well. So feel free to jump in the comments, weigh in with your opinions. We'll try and keep an eye on them and ask any questions as we go along. So Courtney, I want to hear a little bit. Let's take us back. How did you get into this? How did you get into the vintage selling world? We want to hear.
You know, I feel like this is a common thing with a lot of sellers, where when you're asked what started your love of vintage, what got you into it, I feel like there's never an exact moment. I just always remember loving it and being really drawn to it, whether it was from watching old movies or just going to antique stores since as far back as I can remember. I love history and I love pieces with stories. And I just remember growing up and looking at something my grandparents had that belonged to their parents, or, you know, some distant relatives, and learning about the history behind it and thinking, wow, someday someone's going to find this and they're going to learn about this person, and this piece is just going to be a physical representation of them. And ever since I was young, I just always felt amazement by that.
Yeah. And you had a piece, I think, when you were younger, right? That kind of kicked it all off for you.
Oh, yes. It was when I was in elementary school. I went to this tiny little country antique shop. And back then, I didn't know what antiques or vintage pieces were. I just knew that I liked this store with a bunch of cool things. And I found this really beautiful 1950s robin's egg blue train case. And it came with a little key, and it had a little tray in it. And I remember seeing it and thinking, this is the most magnificent thing I've ever put my eyes on. And I took it everywhere. I carried it with me when we went to the lakes, and anytime I traveled, and I'd just be lugging around this big train case as a kid. And I remember the smell of it. It smelled vintage. And it's a smell today that just reminds me of that memory, and I still have it today. It's one of my prized possessions, and it's nothing designer or anything like that. It's just a memory from childhood that reminds me that even the smallest things that some people see as being insignificant can mean so much. And it sparked me. It's a perfect representation of why I love what I do.
Love it. So that somehow ended up into becoming Carmine and Hayworth Vintage in Fargo. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how you actually started up your store, just to kind of give people a little bit of insight into how you are where you are now, which, I mean, you started, was it 5 years ago now? Six years ago, yeah. Right? You just had your birthday the other day.
It's great. I mean, really, when I was looking through all of my notes and thinking, wow, it's been a journey. And I mean, when I first started selling, I amassed such a big collection of things that I was running out of room. My tiny little one-bedroom apartment in college was just packed to the brim to where you could barely walk around. Not hoarder status, collector status. And when I was in college, I was paying my way through college and I needed extra money, and I was told about Etsy, and I thought, well, I have a lot of pieces that I don't mind parting with, and it's a way to quickly make money and alleviate some of my school debt. So back in 2011, 2012, I started my Etsy shop. And back then, I mean, Instagram was just becoming a thing. No one used it to sell pieces at that time. So I mainly just relied on Etsy and people finding it somehow. And slowly I started using Instagram to market those pieces. And flash forward to 2018 when I started my first tiny little studio, brick and mortar. I was just starting to go away from Etsy because that's when a lot of the fee increases were starting, and I was having a hard time navigating that landscape. So I had my little studio. I did all of my Etsy listings out of that. I had multiple jobs that I worked every day to save up so I could pay for that studio space. And slowly, as I did markets and did any event I could, collaborated with anybody that would give me the time of day, I was able over the years to save up enough money to where the opportunity came along to have the current space that I have now. That's a beautiful window space right on our main street in downtown Fargo. And I officially opened in my main store in February of 2020, a month before the COVID shutdown here in the States. And from there is when I started to go full force into e-commerce. And I had plenty of time to sit and plan that out and teach myself how to do SEO and teach myself how to become an e-commerce manager. And that got me through, barely. And here I am, still scrappy and clawing my way to survive in this retail landscape.
Still slinging vintage. I love
yes.
So tell us a little bit about what you sell. For the people who aren't familiar with you or your shop, your fashion dealer, give us an idea of the inventory. I want to hear about it before so that people have kind of a context when we are talking about prices and all that kind of stuff.
Sure. So I predominantly sell vintage clothing. I sell vintage clothing for all genders. I sell vintage decor. I do have some vintage textiles and sewing notions. But early on, especially as a consumer of vintage clothing, I knew that vintage clothing isn't known for being inclusive. And there were a lot of pieces I couldn't wear, and I hated the feeling of going into shops and feeling like I couldn't shop there. So I wanted to find a way to show people that you are welcome here regardless, and I want you to find something you're gonna love. So I started carrying vintage inspired clothing, but the caveat was it had to follow similar, I guess, markers of what vintage clothing is. It has to come from a small business, indie brand, follow ethical sourcing, ethically made. And I was able to get pieces that still have the spirit of vintage and still have the quality of really good vintage pieces. But I was able to offer it for people regardless of gender, body shape, anything like that. And just wanted more people to be able to enjoy it and get in on the fun.
That's great, yeah. And people can come in with their friends and everybody can find something. I love that.
Exactly.
That's great. So tell us a little bit about the landscape. Sorry, I'm just going to grab a Kleenex. This is live, so tell us a little bit about the landscape that you are selling in Fargo, North Dakota. You're in the Midwest of the U.S., and that's going to kind of come back when we are talking about prices a little later on. So tell me about the vintage scene there.
You know, I'm not gonna lie, it's hard. It's not an area that is known for embracing things that are different. We're very much like a white t-shirt and blue jeans kind of area. So, you know, being a vintage shop who loves crazy patterns and colors and flipping, you know, just what it means to wear clothing and finding different ways to wear clothing and getting every gender in on the fun. It's a little bit of an uphill battle because this is a very conservative area in clothing, in finances. I mean, any part of it. It's hard, and I find myself constantly trying to find different ways to reach people and entice them to at least come in and give it a try. Vintage tends to turn some people off because they don't quite understand what it means. And I feel like they get a little scared of things they don't know and aren't easy and palatable for them. So it's constantly a practice in thinking on your feet and being creative, but meeting people where they're at and just showing them that it's fun to learn about new things. Even if you don't want to wear vintage, you can learn about it. And it's fun just to see what other people come up with.
Yeah. When you say that, you know, it's something that they're not familiar with, is it the style? Is it is it the material? Is it,
it's definitely,
it's like, I don't know how to style this piece. I don't know what to do.
Yeah, I mean, growing up, I born and raised in Fargo, North Dakota, and it's an area of the country that people don't want to stand out. It's farming country. It's not like a New York City or Los Angeles where you have a lot of different style perspectives all coming together at once. It's definitely a lot more understated, and people don't want to stand out. And even wearing something with a little bit of like glitter on it or sequins can be really, really scary to people. So, and that's where when people hear vintage, I had one customer who said, well, when I think of vintage, I think of the big 80s prom dresses with like the big sleeves and sequins. And I told him, well, it can even mean a really pretty, you know, camel colored linen button down top from the 70s. Vintage means so many different things. It's not just the costume aspect that some people tend to think of right away. A lot of it's wearable. Very wearable. You can mix and match. There are pieces for everyone. Even if you are very minimal and you like just clean, simple style, you can find that in vintage. And you can tailor it to what you like and what your style is.
Absolutely, yeah. And I know you do a lot of work on that with your photo shoots and styling and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Trying to show people how to wear these things. I mean, now that vintage, I know you might have a different definition of it, but now that vintage is up to 2004, we're getting up to, I think now, which is, you know,
Yep.
Here in the, we can have a debate about that, I guess. But there's more, I guess, contemporary styles is what I'm trying to say. You know, there's stuff from the 90s, obviously, that, you know, that is on trend right now. I mean, Y2K and the 90s are in, so there's something for everyone. So I think you're segueing nicely into talking a little bit about what a vintage dealer does, because the education piece that you were talking about is a huge part of it, and trying to show people what the stuff actually is, right? So maybe you can give us kind of a little peek into what you do, because I think it's important to talk about what a seller does, because a lot of people are under the impression that you just grab a piece and you throw it up on the rack in your store and the price goes up, right? So that's why I want to talk a little bit about that. So tell us a little bit about a day in your life.
So a typical day is, you know, I'm the only one that works at my shop. I'm the sole person here, so every day it's different, but I also have a lot that I have to get through. And just recently I had this really big buying appointment. I filled up my car filled with clothing, and so there was an entire day where I spent going through and processing it, seeing what needed to be done. Does it need mending? Does it need to be laundered? Does it need steaming? All of these different things, and very rarely can a piece just be priced and put on the rack. I wish that happened. Usually doesn't. So in a typical day, I open, I get my social media stuff ready. I try to pre-plan posts to put up right away in the morning so I don't have to worry about it. And I typically spend the day steaming. We do mending in store, so I try to mend as many clothes as I can, launder them, and try to get them ready to start photographing. I have a little area in the back of my shop where I can photograph pieces, get things measured, get the descriptions ready, edit the photos. So every day it's pretty much a laundry list, literally, of things to do and pieces. There's never a dull moment. There's always something coming in the front door and things to look at and people to talk to, and it's just this always like a revolving door every single day of new tasks that come up, and it's a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah. What about when your store is closed? You don't necessarily have the day off. So
Yep.
what are you doing? Are you sourcing? What do you do?
Yes. So up until I think it was February, since 2018 worked 6 days a week in the shop, and Mondays were always my off days. And that I took Tuesdays off the past few months, but I'm back to being open 6 days a week again. And my typical close day at the shop basically is I have a little bit of time to get my personal affairs in order, appointments, but that's where I fit in all of the travel buying appointments. And I like to come into the shop and photograph everything for the website so I can get all of that done without interruptions, and boom, 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 get the photos done, measurements. And so those days are typically things that I like to do behind the scenes, and I don't have to try doing them while I have customers, because I like to be present when I have people in the shop. I don't like having all of these time-consuming projects. So I try to get all of that done on our close days, all of the not fun, glamorous, non-glamorous things.
And we'll come back to your sourcing, because I really want to give people a deeper understanding of what sourcing really is and what's involved. But before that, I think maybe because I called this session an inside look at what a dealer does, and that's kind of the traditional language, just to call you a vintage dealer, and that's what you are. But I wanna talk about definitions, because we do use a lot of terms in this space.
Oh, yes.
We use seller, we use reseller, dealer, curator, vintage seller. I've had posts before, and people have weighed in with what they prefer. A dealer is really somebody who buys and sells vintage or antiques, vintage and antiques, whatever. What does that term really mean to you? Like, what do you most identify with, and what do you think encapsulates that?
That it's something I've only been thinking about recently when I've been reading the articles you've been doing, because I never knew how to classify myself. I always thought of myself as a vintage seller, but that never quite felt completely right for what I do. So I had to underline some of that, because I've had people say that it feels like my shop is very curated, and it's not. I just pick random pieces and put them on the floor. Everything has an intent, and I have a very specific vision of what I want to see on the floor. But I do sell. I do deal in vintage clothing. I work one-on-one with people who are trying to sell and help alleviate some of the burden of family estates. And so really, I feel like a lot of sellers are always such a mix of all of the above, especially when you get the research element into it, when you have pieces that you have to research and you put a lot of thought into them. That's where the curated part comes in, because there's so much more thought and it's a different feeling. So I feel like almost all of the above. It's a hard one. I feel like there's not one term that encapsulates everything. I just don't like people calling me a salesperson. That's because I want people to find pieces that they love and they're connected to. I don't just want them to buy something. I'm not just trying to sell something to you. So I don't like just being called a salesperson. It's deeper than that for me, at least.
You have sales skills. I mean, you own a store. But yes, I totally get what you're saying. Hey, Joy, thanks for saying hi. If anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in there. Yeah, I think it's you with your inventory in particular because you do carry a lot of old Hollywood stuff, a lot of 40s, 50s, 60s. And because you do order a bricks and mortar, it's got that kind of like museum feel, like a wearable
Yeah.
museum, right? I don't want to use the word museum because then people
But
are
it's
like, oh, I'm
true.
not going to go there and,
It's true.
and try
It's
this
true
stuff on.
though.
But yeah, it's kind of where that museum curator, that sort of
Yep.
vibe comes from.
Exactly.
And I think it is important to note that when we're talking about, resale, resellers, vintage sellers, as a whole, sort of, that everybody's shops has that kind of, they're picking things that align with what it is that they want to present to the world, whether it's, all a theme or from a certain era, or it's that kind of vibe or whatever. So there is certainly a curation element, from, I would say, most independent sellers, right?
Oh,
where
yeah.
where it's not just we're just grabbing whatever we think can sell, and it's good.
And that's the cool part of it. And I always like to tell people I've never been to a vintage, like no two vintage shops are alike, because it really, like you said, it reflects the person who's choosing the items and the connections they're making and the people they're bringing in. And it really is, it's amazing just to see how different shops can be. Because I mean, it's hard to find any two vintage items that are the same in general. So when you apply that to actual shops, whether it's online or in person, they're all just as individual as the seller themselves. And I always find that the most fascinating part, because you can really see and learn a lot about the seller based on everything they've collected and how they put it out to the world.
Absolutely. And that is in and of itself a service, and we will talk about that a bit later as well. I want to hear a bit more, though. You've talked a little bit about getting an item ready for sale. Yes. And the things that you have to do, you have to look to see if it's needs mending or alterations, or washing it or whatever. Can you just take us kind of start to finish, from sourcing or even pre-sourcing work? Like, it's you're not necessarily just going out to source something. You might have to look into where to get that item. I'd love for you to kind of do a nose to tail, if you will, about how you source, and what you do to get that item out onto the shop floor.
So typically when I have someone reach out to me interested in selling pieces, the number one thing I ask is what are you selling? Because I like to eliminate things right off the bat, because I don't sell shoes, I don't sell a lot of kitchenware, because I don't want to waste someone's time bringing pieces in here unless I know it's something that I'm really interested in for the shop. So I kind of do a pre-screening where I ask them, are you selling clothing? Okay, if it's clothing from the mid 2000s, that's not vintage to me, so I'm going to pass on that. And once we get through that, some people are able to send me photos so I can get a better idea of the condition, what I'll be working with. But I like to get an idea of what I'm going into so I can start preparing myself for, okay, what am I going to be able to offer them? What am I going to be able to do that's going to make them feel like this was worth their time, that their pieces are going somewhere that they're going to be appreciated? And so I have to mentally prepare myself so I know what I'm going into. And when I do get into the buying appointments, I like to ask the person, where are these pieces coming from? Are they a family member? Are they pieces that you've collected? And get a little bit of a story behind them and where a lot of the pieces came from. That's the number one thing I look for. Just information I can pass on to the person purchasing it. So once I establish that and can get to know the person selling a little bit better, I can finally start going through all the pieces. And I try to categorize things by, this is ready to sell, in terms of maybe I just have to steam it and like freshen it up a bit, or what pieces are going to need mending, what pieces are going to need laundering. And I try to just separate them, put them into categories so that when I can go to the person, I can show them exactly where my thought process is in terms of what I'm offering them and why I'm offering them what I am. I try to make it more of a conversation, and instead of, okay, I'm buying all this stuff, this is what I'm giving you, you can't look at it, you can't look through it, just say yes now and I can leave. It's a lot more involved. And I've had people that I've purchased from say that they didn't realize how involved it was. They thought it was just gonna be, I'm gonna pick out clothes, here's the money, and leave. And some people want that, and I respect it, and I try to tailor that to them. But I like to know the stories, and I really want to pay attention to what I'm purchasing, and knowing that if someone is going to buy this, are they going to be happy with it? Are they going to see it as, wow, I couldn't have found this anywhere else, and now I have a story attached to it, and just creating that whole experience. And once I finally get my goodies, I bring them to the shop and hang them all up, and then start the long task of getting them ready to put on the floor. And a lot of times it's mending seams, sewing on buttons. We just had a big lot where there's at least 50 to 60 items that all had to be spot treated and laundered and freshened up and mended. And so it's a long process. And typically I have racks and back of clothing I've been working on throughout the year that are in different stages of mending, laundering, pricing, so that eventually I have pieces I can keep backfilling and bringing out throughout the year and keeping it as fresh as possible. So it really is an ongoing process, which I love that. I like the constant everyday process of doing it. But I know a lot of sellers just like to do everything at once, or they don't want to have to do the mending because that takes a lot of time. And so that's a process that's worked for me so far.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you have the space, you have the store to be able to do that. And I think, for an online seller, it's definitely more of a, I need to batch, do this in a batch and get this out.
Exactly.
But that doesn't mean it's not still happening in the same way. With the fixing up and the washing and everything like that.
Very overwhelming.
Yeah. I think when we're talking about prices, then, when somebody comes to you with a bundle of clothing and, they might have a certain price in mind, right? That they want when they are coming to give you, well, I don't want to say give you, but sell their stuff to you. And you just told us about this sort of second part that happens afterwards, that once you get the clothes, then you're working on the clothes. So that's what, why the price tag ends up being higher on the floor. Can you talk to us, about about the conversations that you have with people about that, and sort of what the spread is really, if somebody was to bring something to you, what you would be able to offer them for it?
See, and that's a question that I always love answering, because I feel like it should be as transparent as a process as possible. Especially after working corporate retail, I know what the other end of it's like, and that's what makes vintage shops different, is there's a conversation that happens, and I feel like that makes it way more meaningful when people walk into your door. And I like to get an idea of what these pieces that people bring in, what it means to them. I have a lot of people that bring in pieces that belong to their parents, belong to someone they cared about, and I know that these are pieces that are hard for them to part with. They're attached to them. So I need to be very mindful of when I offer them a price, or what I'm willing to buy for it. I want to make sure I can tell them this is exactly why I'm pricing it out. And if there are pieces that need mending, okay, I have 5 buttons that need to be replaced, and I have to spot treat it and mend seams. And I try to make it as conversational as possible to show them that this price I'm offering you isn't coming off the top of my head. I'm adding all of these factors, but also wanting to keep it fair, and I want you to get what you want out of it. And I've been able, it's a lot easier now, 5 or 6 years later, to be able to meet people halfway, because I've had so much practice having that conversation. But it really is just seeing how much these pieces mean to people, and I find that a good jumping off point as I have that conversation with them. And a lot of them are just really happy that we're talking about it. And it's not just an object, it's something that a lot of thought is going into, and they can feel good knowing that their mother's wedding dress is going somewhere that is going to ensure that it gets a good home, but also not rip them off and not rip the customer off.
Yeah.
So it feels almost like an equation or like chemistry, just tailoring it to each person I buy from and each person I meet. So it feels like it's always evolving, always changing.
Curated in its own way, I suppose.
Yep.
Pricing conversation. What about the research that's involved? I mean, you mentioned getting these stories from people to find out. What about other research that you have to do when you get a piece? Can you tell me a little bit about what's involved with that?
Oh yes, that is one of my favorite parts. I'm a book nerd. I like writing papers. I like research elements, and I get a lot of pieces in that they have labels, they have history behind them, and even if it's a Vanity Fair 1970s slip, there's always history behind it. And I love going on to online seller forums. I know the Vintage Seeker, we have, a seller forum, people can ask questions, and I love reaching out to other sellers and seeing what information they have about pieces, what literature they've been looking at. I have a lot of books that customers have given me throughout the years about textiles and different labels and a specific fabric, and I use all of those to create the descriptions of an item. Again, it goes into, I feel like that's what makes each piece valuable to someone in terms of not money, but I got this vintage 1970 slip, and this was a time when Vanity Fair only released this certain pattern and this certain fabric, and I just feel like information is fun, and you should be informed about what you're buying, not just with vintage clothing, but with clothing in general. But with vintage, there's history behind it, and I love tidbits. And anytime I can whip out one of my little fabric encyclopedias and show people, look at this fabric I found. This is how you can clean it. Any excuse I can have to do that, I use it, even if it seems like a really simple, not super exciting brand or article of clothing. It's fun.
Yeah. Well, and I think having that extra information on an item probably has long-term value in that you're a little less likely to get rid of it right away.
Oh yeah,
right? Like when you
exactly
feel a little bit more attached to something, the history behind it, how special that piece is.
Yes.
There's there's not that same relationship that people have when they get a tank top for $4 from companies that I'll leave unnamed. So.
Well, and the perfect example of it, it was 2 years ago. I had this wonderful gentleman whose wife she was going through the beginning stages of dementia, and it was progressing pretty rapidly, and they both came together and decided that they wanted to find a place to bring all of her treasured garments and pass on the stories while she could still remember them. And she wasn't in the physical state to be able to come into my shop. I was able to go to the car and meet her, and she had done up her makeup. She was in her early 90s, had her vibrant red hair. She's a beautiful, beautiful woman. And her husband sat up front with me, and we went through every article of clothing, and he told me where she got it and the history behind it. And this was what was happening in her life at the time she bought this. And through talking to him, I found out she actually owned a salon. She was a salon owner in Fargo from the 50s to about the 70s, early 80s. She had a salon right above my shop. And I had no idea salon was even above my shop. And he told me that, these were pieces that she wore when she saw clients, but then she ended up getting hired to be a hair and makeup educator in Los Angeles in the 80s. And this is all of the beautiful beaded gowns she wore to events and speaking engagements. And, this is something she got when she was hiking in the Himalayas with a friend and met someone from the palace of the Maharaja at the time, who invited her to come to the palace and do hair and makeup for his family. And the thing that sticks out is she described this massive oil portrait in the background of her doing makeup of Rita Hayworth, which is one of the namesakes of my shop. And when I had pieces from her in the store that people would buy, I would ask, do you have a couple of minutes so I can tell you about this beautiful sweater and the woman that owned it? And just seeing how excited people would get and knowing that, oh my gosh, there was a real human who loved this and owned this. And the amount of people that said these are going to be items they're going to cherish and keep because of the story behind it, it's no better feeling. And her husband was so beyond thrilled that his wife mentally was losing these memories, but now they were living on in her clothing, being passed on to other people who've never met her, that are still continuing to spread that story. It's the best memory I have, and it's why I do what I do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying not to get choked up right now.
I know. I started tearing up, and it was an amazing. I haven't seen them in a year and a half, and they were going through a lot of things, and family-wise, and knew that if they didn't bring these pieces in, they would have all been thrown, which is a lot of what I've encountered when helping people with estates and helping them organize a lot of their pieces. A lot of things get thrown, and these pieces would have ended up in the garbage had he not, was determined to get down here. He had his walker, he had everything piled on his walker, and he was determined to get them here and make sure that they were going to survive and live another 50, 60, 70 years.
Yeah. There's something very human about that, and we talked about you being a curator before, but also, a keeper of the stories, a historian, and you're doing your sidebar. You're doing that actively with your archive project. Why don't you talk a little bit about that quickly, and then we'll get back into pricing. I would love people just to know about it because it's a really cool thing.
So I have been collecting clothing for as long as I can remember, and there are pieces that when I started my shop, I had a lot of things that I could sell. A lot of people would joke that I could easily open a shop with how much stuff I accumulated, but there are pieces that I just felt were special and got me excited. And I love talking to people about different sewing techniques and different labels and history behind pieces. So I started keeping some of these things at my shop in a back room, knowing that, well, maybe one day someone will come in and I can say, hey, I've got this early 1900s corset cover in the back with this specific type of embroidery, and you said you like it, so I have it, and I can bring it up and show you in person. And then I just kept bringing pieces to the shop and keeping them in the back room to the point where it now has become this archive. And over the years, I've been trying to photograph it whenever I can and write descriptions and get them up online so people can study them, see them, have access to them. And it's been amazing to see people get as excited about it as I do. And I have actually one of my pieces. I know this was in the notes further down somewhere, but I have it just here. But part of our Hollywood collection, like I have Debbie Reynolds' bra.
Amazing.
From the 1953 film I Love Marvin, and it's one of my prized possessions because she wore it hot off the heels of Singing in the Rain, and it's stained and it's sweaty and amazing, but it still has like the MGM call tag and her name on it. And so it's been fun whipping this out and saying, you may not like my shop or vintage, but I have Debbie Reynolds' bra. Yeah. And that has to stand for something.
It does. I wrote down the movie title because I'm a movie girl, so I love movies.
It's really good, and I found I was able to, with the scene numbers that they write into the garment labels, from a past auction of Debbie Reynolds, her estate back in 2011, I was able to find that the numbers correlated with the exact scene in the movie that she wore it in.
Mm.
And that bra was worn under a costume where she was dressed up as a human football. And male chorus football players would kick her around and she would fly. And it was crazy because this bra has no stretch. It's, I imagine uncomfortable, but it fits just perfectly under that little leotard. But being able to match that up was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's really neat. Awesome find. I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit in our notes because I'm gonna come back to the vintage thrift combo. But since you're talking about auctions here, I want people to get an understanding. I want consumers, shoppers to get an understanding of acquisition of inventory, and what is involved, kind of from a general standpoint and your personal experiences. So, I mean, you mentioned auctions. Can you talk to us a little bit about like where you get all your stuff and what's involved? Like, how do you bring it all in?
It's a little mix of everything. I mean, in terms of the pieces I sell, 90% of what I have I get from one-on-one buying appointments, but the other 10% I get from auctions, and more specifically, I love menswear, vintage menswear and lingerie. That's where my heart is. It's my bread and butter. It's what I'm most passionate about. But they can be the hardest to find and source, especially in this area. So when I'm looking for something really specific, I tend to go the auction route where you have collectors or other shops trying to liquidate bigger groupings of these items. Because I know I personally don't love selling shoes. So if I get a bunch of shoes in that I don't want, I put them in a big lot and I sell them on eBay to other sellers who can sell them and do well with them. And the same goes for when I buy lingerie and vintage menswear. That's my love, not necessarily someone else's. So when I'm looking for specific mass groupings of things, like eBay, auction sites, that's always where I head to.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's important to talk about because, a store like yours, you're using auctions, you're doing the one-on-one buying appointments. You might be going to estate sales or viewing private collections. I think actually leaving the store to go view the collection. I mean,
Yep.
And there's a lot of other sellers who, yes, they go to the thrift store or they go here or they source on Facebook Marketplace or they go to garage sales or other estate sales or whatever. So I think what I really want to illustrate is sort of the variety, the myriad places that you can source from and how that all sort of feeds into what you're doing and sort of the time that requires and the labor that requires, because that again comes back to the pricing, right? So why the price is what it is. A seller sources from really all over. And the other thing that you're doing at these, especially say if you're in person at an auction or if you're getting these one-on-one buying appointments, is your relationship building and your networking.
Oh yeah.
So can you talk to me a little bit about like sort of how you've built your connections over time and how you've been able to get inventory out of that?
It really just I hate the word organically when it comes to things like this, but it's the only thing that makes sense. But it really started when I finally was able to have a physical presence in town with my little studio spot in the basement of a building downtown. When I would get curious people coming in, those curious people would ask, do you buy pieces? Because I have a lot of vintage, or I know someone and they don't know where to go, and they don't know if they want to donate it. They wanted to see like what the other avenues are. And I started meeting people through them just coming into my tiny little hole in the wall space and meeting people at markets, and it just slowly grew to where I have one woman that I still buy from that I met when I first opened my studio space in 2018, and I've been buying pieces that she slowly has been willing to let go over the years. And it almost has felt like a slow burn. But it's all face to face. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of it are people that come into my shop or just cold call and ask, and that's the majority of how I've built up these relationships, just face to face, being here, being present, and meeting people, which is easier said than done. But when I was online, I did a lot of picking, like a lot of sellers do, going to different markets and antique shops, and so it's evolved. Now I don't have time to do that and go out there. So when people can come to me and I can meet them that way, I hold on to those relationships for dear life, and I try to foster those any way I can.
Yeah. And picking, for anybody who's not familiar with the term, can you define it for anybody on the call?
So it's going out and finding these pieces. And I loved going to antique malls because you have pieces from all these different vendors and so many different categories and interests. And I used to love going through there, and my rationale when I started selling, I would see things I wanted to buy for myself personally, and then to counter, just to balance that out, I would find things that, okay, well, I can buy this because I found this and I can sell it, and that will cover what I'm paying for all of these personal things that I just really want. And it started evolving from there. But I have friends who go to estate sales, like they're, experts at finding the best estate sales, being first in line, spending hours in line, going to every garage sale. I have another friend that travels the state, going to different thrift stores and just going places and picking through racks and shelves and trying to find these pieces that a lot of people don't have time or energy to find themselves. And it's a lot of work, but a lot of us like the thrill of the hunt, and you hear that all the time. They love the thrill of the hunt and exciting, and when you find someone who loves it and wants to buy it, it's like a high. I've heard a lot of people just say it's like a high.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great sort of transition into talking about that service aspect and the fact that a vintage dealer, a reseller is consistently going out to find these things, and it's very easy for a shopper to be like, I could have found this for $4 at the thrift, but the point is that seller went to 20 thrifts or 20 antique malls or 20 estate sales, and found that at one of them. And it's you don't necessarily have the same luck when you're going out to do it yourself, on the one-off time. So I want to talk a little bit about that, but I think from a bigger perspective, this concept of thrifting and how it has kind of become a catch-all term in the 2020s. Like the definition has absolutely evolved from when, you were thrifting in the 90s.
Exactly.
A lot of people, especially, younger people, are using that term thrifting to refer to shopping for all forms of secondhand, including vintage, including antiques. Why do you think that conflation started happening, and what's really going on?
I've tried to pinpoint that, and I really feel like, as with a lot of things recently, the pandemic, I think, really shifted a lot of that. When you would have people going out traditionally thrifting in stores and going to your local Goodwill during the pandemic shutdown, you couldn't do that anymore. So people were going to platforms like Depop and Poshmark, and I knew sellers that, since they couldn't find pieces in person, they used these apps and platforms to try sourcing other pieces. And I think through that, because of social media, that's where the lines have been kind of blurred, where what does thrifting mean anymore? And is it, are you thrifting? I've had people say they thrifted a really cool vintage Sheen piece on Depop. I'm like, that's not. But with social media, you don't have someone there that you can interact with who's telling you, you know, this is what this is, and having that conversation, you see it, you have to figure that out for yourself. And when you take out the physical world aspect of it, a lot of context is lost. And I mean, it feels like a jumble. Yeah. I've tried so hard to figure out where it started to shift, but I really do think the pandemic just kind of threw that into a tizzy, and you throw social media on top of it. The education part got lost, and the definitions got lost, and it's caused a lot of, I know, a lot of hurt and anger within the community. And I always blame social media.
I know it's so good for so many things, for stuff like this, talking to you know, our communities. But yeah, it's definitely, and there are humans who do this, and you know, I know it still happens. I think it was really bad, you know, when everyone was at home, and people were in the comments making comments. But you know, I think that word thrift, that it has, you know, it means getting something for less. Like at originally, historically, thrift stores were a place where you could get stuff for less. Yeah. And you know, we'll talk about the thrift stores a bit, but that idea of getting something for less, the idea of using thrifting as a term for all shopping secondhand, including, you know, a shop like yours, a vintage dealer shop, somebody who's stocking antiques, all that stuff. Exactly. It's problematic, and it's difficult, because then there's this assumption that the price should be low, or the price should be affordable. Not saying that there shouldn't be affordable vintage, of course. And I know that you're very dedicated to trying to keep your prices approachable. But you know, I think there are levels within the market, right? There are always going to be levels of prices of things. But yeah, it's just a phenomenon that I've kind of noticed. Well, we've all noticed it, I think. And it's challenging, because used doesn't always mean less, right? And in fact, value goes up sometimes.
Well, and I've noticed lately, and this is why I did my podcast episode on it, because I was getting this reaction and conversation from a lot of different people, and it really irked me. And when people come into my shop, I've had conversations where the first thing they ask, is this thrift? Is this used? And they use it, to them it's such a dirty word. And I've tried to understand why that thought has made people feel that way. And the more I talk to people, that's always the connotation they have is, well, vintage is used clothing, and thrift is used clothing. And I had one person say, it's just dirty stuff that no one wanted anymore. And I don't know where that kind of vitriol behind the word started to amplify. And I know it's always been there in some form. I mean, a lot of us who thrifted as kids out of necessity, you know, kids made fun of you for thrifting your clothing, but it was because you paid less for it. But now it feels different. Like the term now has taken on a completely different meaning that has made people cringe when they come into vintage or thrift stores, and it's hard to listen to.
Yeah, if they're not familiar with the world. And I know that you know, obviously vintage and thrifting is extremely popular right now, so I don't want to say that like people aren't on board with it, but I do think that it comes from some very deep-seated, quite frankly, like classist notions about what it means to thrift, which is why it's then interesting that it's being used as a term for everything. You know, I think it's quite a complicated discussion. Even the word thrift, as far as thrift stores, I mean, I've posted about this a few times. You know, the prices have changed a lot, especially at the for-profit thrift stores, at the big chains. Thrift doesn't really mean what it used to there either. So
not at all.
Yeah, it doesn't always mean that. So, you know, when people are asking it, I think if you were to put a picture of, a Goodwill store, a thrift store beside your boutique, and, people would be able to visually see the differences. There's a real curation aspect, like you were saying earlier, that happens at Carmine and Hayworth. Whereas at the thrift store, everything gets put out on the racks. Like it's a different kind of store.
Exactly.
But you kind of still, you get that question, and how do you actually respond to people, and how do you have that open and honest and empathetic conversation? Because not everybody knows, right? So you need to have that dialogue. How do you do it?
And that I love when people ask, because again, like when someone asks me, what does vintage mean? I've learned that means a lot of different things to not even just customers and consumers, but vintage sellers also. I look at it as, I do 25 years and older is what I consider vintage. I've met some sellers that consider 5 years and older vintage. And so when people come in, they genuinely don't know what exactly does that mean. And so when I've had people coming in ask, well, is this all used clothing or thrift clothing? I like to see, well, what does that mean to you? And here, I don't carry pre-loved or secondhand new contemporary clothing. And that's usually how I start it. I don't carry, pre-loved Forever 21 or anything within the past 10 or 15 years. It's either brand new from indie brands or it's 25 years and older. And that's usually the biggest thing I try to highlight. So with thrift stores, you get new pre-loved clothing. You can find vintage clothing. You can find a mix of everything. But in vintage stores, I have more of a select vision of what I want. And if I want 50s, 60s, and 70s, that's what I try to tailor it to. And typically when I say, I don't carry pre-loved modern clothing, then it's, oh, okay, yes, I get what you mean. And that's where the confusion is. And it means different things to different sellers. And I like when people ask, what does vintage mean to you? And, okay, you don't carry, t-shirts that are from 5 to 10 years ago. You carry 50s, 60s, 70s. That's what that means to you. And it does have a lot of confusion attached to it. And I don't think anybody should be afraid to ask. And that's the point of it, is I want people to get engaged and have that conversation and know where my head is at and why I carry what I carry. And they're two different things, but they're two different things in a way that suits the person coming in.
Yeah. And then that kind of can lead into having kind of a kind and open conversation about pricing.
Oh, exactly.
How, if you had your dream customer encounter, I would love to know how you would want a customer to talk to you about why something is priced a certain way. Like what would you love to see?
I've actually had these dream customers, and it always starts just out of genuine curiosity. And I do feel like if you don't understand how something's priced, you're the one paying for it. You have every right to ask. It's your money, and you should know why you're paying this amount. And I do get people coming in and they'll ask, I saw this dress in another vintage, or not this exact dress, but a dress from this period in another vintage store, and I noticed that your price is different than theirs. Can you tell me like why that is, and why prices can be different? And that's where it's a great opportunity to talk about, well, actually, this dress I had to bring into a seamstress to repair the lining, because the lining inside was shredded. So yeah, this one is $15-20 more expensive because I had to pay someone to fix it. Or this is actually a lot cheaper than you expected because it has a little discoloration or stain on the bottom that I can't get out. And there's always a reason. I like to tell people I don't just price something just because it's the first thing that pops out of my head. It's, what did I purchase it for, what's the work that went into it, but also what's fair.
Mhm.
And you can price anything any way you want, realistically, but just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Mhm.
And I love when people really want to know, because it shows that they're thinking about it, and they're thinking about what they're buying, and it shows me that it means something to them.
Right.
And I never get offended. I want people to ask, and if it's not a price that they want to take the jump on, then that's it.
Yeah.
At least they learn something, and what my process is.
Well, and sometimes it can be something that may not even be able to see. Like, I mean, you mentioned there might be a repair, but the condition actually might be different. Like, it's possible yours is in better shape than the one that they saw, you know, at a different place. Have you ever had somebody who's like, you know, come to say that, you know, I saw this at the thrift store for $4, and like, why is it this much here?
Actually, I just had a person in today who is notorious for coming into my shop and doing this. Sometimes I think she just likes busting my chops just because. But I had someone come in, and I love like vintage hair scarves. I love anything that you can get multi-use out of. And I bought a bunch of them from a woman who was going through all of her mother's estate, and her mother collected scarves, and I wanted to give her a fair price for this lot. So from what I paid her, I was able to, you know, price it down to where each scarf I would charge $5 for. And they all are in beautiful condition, 1950s, wonderful colors, made of silk. So I thought, okay, well, $5 isn't that bad. I feel like that's a pretty good price.
Like, based on what they're seeing.
Yeah, and
continue.
I had her come up to the counter, and she had one, and she goes, I'm gonna buy this. And she leans over and she goes, you know, I could find the same scarf at the thrift store for 25 cents. And I go, oh, well, great. I mean, do you not want to buy this? She goes, oh no, I like it, but I'm just saying. Yeah. So I get that, not super often, but I've learned to just, you know, it is what it is. And she didn't want to have the conversation as to why I priced it the way I did. And, you know, when things go to thrift stores, they're donated. So they have more room to price them down. And if I want to give someone a fair price for something, I would rather do that and price things the way I price them.
Yeah.
I've learned not to let it bother me as much.
That's good. Yeah, that's good. For anybody that's just joining, you'll have to go back and hear all about how Courtney gets these items, and you know why the price is what it is, even though we're talking about a $5 item at this point. You mentioned earlier some like rules for your store that you have about, you know, the years that you want to bring in, sort of the curation, what you want to take when somebody brings in items to a buying appointment. Can you talk about that, why that's kind of meaningful when it comes to actually being able to set those prices?
Oh, yes. I mean, when I get pieces in, I first just like to see the condition. I always want pieces that I know are going to last someone 30, 40, 50, 60, X amount of years. So I get every piece and I flip them inside out. I pull up the seams to see how strong they are. I look at every button, see the label, the care instructions are a really big thing. I like to see what is it going to take for someone to actually maintain this? Does it have to be dry cleaned? Is it something they can throw in the washing machine? I like to make sure that when I sell something to someone, I don't leave anything that they have to go home and do a bunch of research on. They know when they're leaving how to care for it properly. They're getting something that has been inspected and is in the condition stated. And I want people to be super informed, and that's where the prices come from, is you're paying for an item, but also advice on how you don't ever have to pay for this again. Yeah. You're going to have it and you don't have to repeat buy it. and this is an investment piece, even if it's a $25 dress. I want to make sure that if you want to keep this for 50 years, I set you off with every tool you need to ensure that that's what's going to happen and that you can keep it for as long as you want.
Yeah, I think it's so important, because I know we've had chats about it in the comments on my page and stuff, but just this idea that fast fashion has actually made us devalue what an item is worth, and if a shirt should not cost $8, and if a shirt costs $8, it means that somebody got paid 2 cents for making it.
Exactly.
So, having that secondhand shirt that's costing $40, you went out and found that for somebody, and you're gonna let them know how to care for it and keep it, and it's not going to deteriorate because it's already lasted for how long it's lasted.
Exactly. And this is how you can continue that tradition.
Exactly. And paying for that service, I think, is important. I want to talk a little bit about what's been your experience with sort of the difference between vintage shop pricing and thrift shop pricing. We've kind of established what the differences are, and within the thrift store sphere, there are many different kinds of thrift stores. There are our for-profits, there's our nonprofits, our charity shops, kind of our indie shops. And then within the vintage space, there's all kinds of different vintage stores. There's consignment stores, vintage. Some are going to be mid-range prices. Some are going to be luxury. Some are going to be on the more affordable end. Some might just, sell contemporary pre-loved, like you said earlier. What is actually happening for you in Fargo? What is the thrift shop pricing compared to the vintage store pricing? And do you think that has really influenced a lot of these conversations that you're having with customers?
It really hasn't. And full disclosure, I haven't gone into a thrift store in town in years, because the last time I went into one, a lot of the ones that we have in my area tend to get a lot of overstock from like Target or Walmart. So I just stopped going into them out of, I was just feeling some type of way, and I haven't been wanting to go into one because I'm missing the thrift stores of my youth. But talking to friends that are resellers that go to thrift stores and having that conversation, a lot of them have really been shocked at how high prices have been getting, and they've had to start tailoring the way they sell pieces because they're finding that they're paying more, and it's an interesting realm to be in, because when you're going to a thrift store, and I had one of my friends want to buy this vintage prom dress, and it was missing beads and it had stains on it, and I think they were charging $100 for it, which I thought sounded like a lot from what I was always used to. And she goes, yeah, that I normally would maybe pay 15 or $20 for that in the condition, but it's skyrocketed, and how a lot of sellers have been feeling really down by it because all of these things are changing, and it's a different environment, and you can definitely see it's been affecting people, especially people who rely on thrift stores for income, or like dressing their families, and seeing that, okay, well, prices are creeping up there, and even in smaller areas like North Dakota, you can definitely see it's been affecting people in one way or another.
Right. Well, and I think we've spent the last 70 minutes at this point talking about what a vintage dealer does, what a reseller does, and why. And I hope it's clear at this point why those prices should not be what you charge at your vintage store, but they are. When I've talked about that on my page as well. The fact that some of these stores, I don't want to say all of them, but they're using the marketplace, the open marketplace, to set their prices, which is it's not right because of all the reasons that we just talked about for the last 70 minutes about why the prices are different for different levels of the market, and that makes sense. And I also want to again highlight the fact that it's not a supply issue. It's not about not having enough clothing available. So, there's a lot of things that go into pricing. I know we've talked about the service, we've talked about the market demand. Can you talk to me a little bit about the geography? And like you mentioned that you're in the Midwest. I mean, how does that differ from what a seller might be able to charge in Toronto, where I am, or in New York City?
It's vastly different. Especially here in North Dakota, the next biggest city are the Twin Cities, St. Paul and Minneapolis. And being in a town that's kind of surrounded by farm country, access to items is a lot harder. You had a lot of people that, they were farmers, so they had a limited amount of clothing that they wore front to back, left to right. I have someone waving at me.
Hello.
Thank you. Mwah. Another amazing seller, Pam, that's right down the block from me. She has a lovely vintage shop, Violet
Nice.
Vintage. We have a great vintage community here, but sourcing pieces in this area is really, really hard. And when you go to bigger cities, obviously densely populated areas, you have more families, you have more inventory and people wanting to sell and offload. But when the demand is higher, that is when you start to see prices creep up. And it's interesting here because a lot of people, I can't charge anywhere near what I have seller friends in the cities charge, because I just don't have the people willing to invest in a lot of these pieces. So I also have to look at where I'm at and the demand. And I had one seller look at one of my pieces and she goes, gosh, like in Los Angeles, I would sell this for triple what you're charging for it. And I said, that's because you're in an area that has more people. You have more people who are interested in these pieces. Here, it's harder.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot harder.
Yeah. And the price on your website, does it differ much from what's in store? I mean, I know there's a different set of overhead costs that come with the website, and shipping and all that.
Typically, they all are pretty much the same as what I have them in store. The higher price pieces I have are usually ones that I keep in the back room if they're higher than the price point I normally have on my sales floor. And those are pieces too that I always have a fear of them getting compromised on the floor. And especially if I'm charging more for them, I want to make sure they're in the best condition possible. So anything I have on the sales floor that's on the website are all the same prices. But if they're higher priced items, I just don't even put them on the floor. I just keep them in back, and I try to keep it consistent. And so people don't get confused about what they see online versus what they see in here.
Okay. Yeah. One less conversation.
Exactly.
We talked a little bit about, you're aiming to provide reasonably priced items for the people in your geographic area. I mentioned earlier that there's always going to be a range of price points in the secondhand space. So, what's your take on that? Kind of like that idea of the different segments of the market? Because I think there's a little bit of a trend right now as well online that something has to be for everybody, right? Like, so what are your thoughts on that? Like, do you agree that there should be different levels of the market, or do you kind of feel like everybody should kind of be able to access everything?
And it's so hard because I wish there were easier access to vintage pieces. And as time has gone on, especially with social media, this is where I really noticed it, where you have sellers that, you can charge what you want. And is that what you should be charging for something? That's up for debate. But I feel like there's opportunity to keep things accessible and affordable. And it does kind of feel like the Wild West in terms of pricing, because I have met some sellers that they say, well, okay, I have this piece and I saw online that people are charging $800 for it. So that's what I'm going to do. But they don't see that, okay, well, there are 5 of those. They haven't sold in the past year. And it goes back to just because you can doesn't mean you should. There has to be more intent behind it. And I don't want people to feel discouraged when they see that, because typically when you see vintage online, it is higher priced. And if you have a shop in Fargo and you sell a lot of clothing on Etsy, you're reaching more people, so you can ask more for it. And that's where it's, I feel like there's not really a right answer to that. It really is just, I guess, trusting in the seller and finding a seller that you trust, that you know if they're asking this price for something, there's a reason behind it. And but it's hard.
Yeah.
I don't have a good answer for that.
There is no right answer. It's more just, I always want to hear people's opinions. And, I think the other thing about making your products, more, I don't want to say they're on the lower end, but you mentioned that you're in a smaller area. If you were in Toronto, your prices would be costing more, I think. It's safe to say that.
Exactly.
But there's something to be said about pricing it a certain way to ensure that product moves too. Because you talked about maybe that thing hasn't sold in a year, and we want to make sure that this inventory is actually reaching the people that it's meant to be. That people are meant to buy it. And I had a conversation with, she's not on the call right now, but Gina at Nightingale Vintage on the weekend, and she was talking about vintage is meant to be worn, it's meant to be enjoyed by people, so make sure that they can actually enjoy it, right?
Exactly. And that's the point where I don't want things sitting. That isn't the point. I don't run a museum. I run a place where I want people to leave here excited and leaving with something that they can get use out of. And I like that. I like that thought, because it's true. These pieces were meant to live and be worn. And if my prices are preventing someone from accessing that, then I rethink, okay, I don't want this to just collect dust on a rack. It needs to go out there. And if I have to price it as such, then that's the point, is to just keep it moving. And I understand why prices are the way they are, especially variant on location and rent and things like that. But also it's a store, so you want things to keep moving.
Yeah, exactly. You've got those monthly bills to pay. That rent comes up every month somehow.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I guess we're kind of nearing out on 90 minutes here, so I guess we're going to wrap up soon, I think. If anybody has any questions who's still watching, feel free to ask them. I think you talked a little bit in your podcast about there's still kind of deals to be had at thrift stores, and that this is not kind of like everything is overpriced. We talked a little bit about how I wouldn't say that the selling community is responsible for the price increases at thrift stores. It's
not at all.
The thrift stores and their pricing strategies that they're deciding on. But can you talk a little bit kind of about how people can find affordable vintage and where they can go to get well-priced stuff?
And I mean, every location, you have small towns. You have, obviously, if you're in a big city, it gets harder. In any store you go to, whether it's a thrift store or vintage shop, but just find small town antique malls, small town like vintage boutiques, small town thrift boutiques, because their prices are going to be different. And it's just, you have to search. That really is part of it. It can be the fun of it, is just having to search, but don't expect when you're in a big city to find cheap prices for all of the reasons mentioned. It really is location.
Yeah. Especially if there's, a bricks and mortar store and that person's having to pay rent in a city that is where the rents are exorbitant and that kind of thing. So
and rents are only getting higher.
Yeah.
that's the thing. It's getting harder out there, and that's where the conversation piece comes into play. Is there's always a reason for it, and sellers want you to enjoy what they have, and they want you to ask about it. And prices should never be an obstacle. And I feel like a lot of sellers are more than happy to talk about it.
Yeah.
Because that's why we got into it in the first place, is having those conversations.
Yeah.
And not being corporate, stuffy, retail, and rigid. That's the point.
Yeah, and that you're price conscious yourselves, because you're sourcing stuff, you're needing to then turn around and be able to sell it and put the work into it to sell it. So you're used to dealing with prices. I think that there's a very open and kind way to talk about that, and sometimes, especially when we're online, that doesn't always happen. So.
I know, and that's why it scares me. I mean, even I just recently revived my Etsy shop just through this group, and Lemon's Loot, she got me inspired that I think I'll reopen my Etsy shop again, and I was nervous about it, and you get these weird messages, and I had one woman just not be very friendly, and it does make it harder, and it is a scary tech world where you have a lot more reach, but with that comes some of the not nicest people.
Yeah, of course. Well, people can hide behind their keyboards and stuff, and it's tough. And like I said earlier, people are humans doing this, and it can really affect people. Like they kind of get in their head, and I think having that open discussion that you talked about earlier, being able to just kindly ask and be okay with the answer too. I think that's kind of key. As a consumer, you might not like what you heard, but you can also, you don't have to buy it at the end.
Exactly. And that's the thing, you have the freedom of talking to a real person, and it's not this corporate shadow entity, and so you're getting answers. And I think that's all that you can ask for, is just that conversation.
Yeah.
Wherever that leads.
For sure. I want to end on like a couple fun things. You mentioned a movie name earlier. Was it I Love Marvin? That's what I wrote down. I Love. Okay. Do you have any other favorite?
I haven't had my coffee yet, but it's either Marvin or Melvin.
Do you have any other favorite old Hollywood movies that you'd recommend people watch for like really great vintage?
I do. I wrote it down. So my number one, I used to keep a list of films that I loved because they made me cry every single time I watched them. And my all-time favorite is the 1959 version of the film Imitation of Life. It stars Juanita Moore and Lana Turner. That one is amazing. The fashion in it, the storyline is very current. It deals with racism and sexism and two women trying to just survive in life and the challenges they come up with. So that one's one of my favorites. I love Gigi. I love musicals. Gaslight. Gilda, of course, because of Rita Hayworth. I mean, there's two. Anything on TCM is really good. I love
all of it. Awesome. Thank you for the recs. Daryl, hi, at Frock Off Vintage asked, true vintage clothing and vintage t-shirts, not condemning the sellers for either, but do you think there should be a different classification compared to clothing from the 20s and 30s? And we talked a little bit about like vintage definitions earlier, but we didn't get that deep into the types of vintage. What do you think?
That is something I've been thinking about a lot more recently, because especially in Fargo, I've had this conversation with different sellers who there have been a lot more sellers coming up who specialize in vintage t-shirts, but to them vintage means 5 to 10 years. So maybe t-shirts from like 2012, 2013, and I have had sellers ask, do you think that's vintage? Is that in the same class? And I think that answer is just as individual as what people consider vintage to be, whether it's 25 years, 20 years. That's a hard one. and because that's not my passion, are, you know, the streetwear and the t-shirt realm, it's hard for me to answer because there are those sellers that I've talked to who love streetwear and love t-shirts and the graphic elements that look at some of my 60s clothes and go, I would wear that as a costume.
Yeah.
Do people actually wear that? And I think part of that is I know I've learned to accept that as the decades go on and as I get older. I look at vintage differently than people that, what are they, are they Gen Zers now? I'm a millennial.
Yeah.
But
well, and there's alpha underneath, but I don't know how much they're talking about this yet. Well, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
and to them, a really interesting conversation I had for, you know, the Gen Zers who were growing up and you know, graduating high school during the pandemic and having kind of that, you know, arrested development almost. The period of time before the pandemic from 2010 to about 2019 does feel like a different lifetime. And I've had people say, well, that feels like it was a long time ago. So when I see clothing from 2015, it feels like a different period in time, which is true. I mean, I've had a lot of people say that it's pre-pandemic and post-pandemic time. And I've noticed a lot of customers and sellers who specialize in that arena, they see that as a completely different time period because they lived it differently than the rest of us. And so it's a hard question, but a good conversation to have, because I mean, kids graduating during that time, I don't know how that felt. So they're navigating the world differently and they're seeing things differently than my 35 years have seen. And it just shows it's always evolving. The concept of vintage is always evolving, especially in this day and age when anything can happen and time can be so fleeting and can look so differently depending on what's happening in the world.
Yeah, there's like 52 micro trends, 52 micro trends a year now. I think is like the number. No, thank you, Daryl. It's a great conversation, and I think, you know, when we're talking about the word vintage in and of itself, it means of a time, of an era. Exactly. So, you know, in that respect, you know, I think it's fair to call. I usually see it like vintage streetwear, like together. But the type of vintage that you sell, like that kind of mid-century, old Hollywood stuff, maybe there needs to be more language to like define if that's what you sell, then there's a name for it, right?
Exactly.
Because
I like that. I hope that happens and someone can create these new terms, because like you said, it's so much more complex, and you don't want to leave anybody out. And because these are all valid time periods of clothing and they all deserve their own attention and category, and that can fall under the umbrella of vintage. And it's exciting to see how that can evolve.
For sure. Okay, well, maybe we need to just like come up with a word and start using it.
I mean, I hope someone can do it, because I will bow down to them, because it makes like my brain starts to melt trying to come up with different concepts. And it's a lot.
I mean, it's something that like, you can't control how people use stuff, right? So it's like you can try and do it, but there's going to be tons and tons of people who don't use it, and you know,
exactly. Something will stick, something will catch on.
At some point. Tell us. I want to hear about the Elizabeth Taylor piece, because I just think it's the coolest piece. Let's end on that, and tell us about the fact that you own one of Liz Taylor's pieces, which I think is absolutely incredible, because I'm a big fan.
Thank you. I have been shocked at how many people have come in and have never heard of her. I feel myself start to like faint. I have loved her since the moment I could watch movies. My grandparents, I think of as being very old Hollywood. They were travel agents. So they got to travel all over, and they loved watching classic films and that sense of nostalgia and reverence for what came before me. And ever since I saw Elizabeth Taylor, and I'm trying to remember what was the first film I saw her in. I just always remember my life having her in it, which is such a weird thing to say, but in school when they would ask us, what do you want your career to be? Your dream job. Mine would always be cleaning Elizabeth Taylor's jewelry. That was my number one job. And I just loved how she just felt as a person rich. I mean that not in terms of like monetary, but she was such a complex person, but used her celebrity to fight for causes that were severely taboo at the time, like AIDS, and just supporting her friends like Rock Hudson, who felt like he couldn't come out and live his authentic self, and felt like he had to suffer with his diagnosis in the shadows. And she like held their hand and hugged them even when doctors told her, oh, you can catch AIDS from touching someone's hand. And she just fought tooth and nail and was the person that brought a lot of light and attention. And I just see her as being hugely fascinating. And when the opportunity came up for some of her pieces from her estate, one of her former assistants was selling off some of her pieces. I thought, I've got to find a way to do this. And I never thought I'd be able to get anything that she touched or owned ever in my life. So I started selling off pieces in my collection that I knew could help fund that. So I let go of pieces that meant a lot to me for the greater good and for something that meant more. And thankfully, my obsession with vintage was able to help realize this dream, and the fact that I can show people her pieces in person in Fargo, North Dakota, of all places, a place that I don't even know she knew existed. I wouldn't. But now I have one of her coats from the 70s, this beautiful Kelly green belted coat from Neiman Marcus, and I have a peignoir set that was custom made for her around the time that she had gotten back together with Richard Burton. I have this beautiful canary yellow sharp 80s blazer she wore during the time that she was really deep in her fight against AIDS and trying to get recognition and funding. And just having those pieces here and knowing that what people thought of as a hobby was able to help me achieve a childhood dream, and it felt like validation.
Yeah.
That it's not a hobby, it's a passion, and it takes us all different places, and it took me to Elizabeth Taylor's closet.
The closest I get to Liz Taylor is the photo of her in my bathroom. I've got a picture of her Cat in a Hot Tin Roof when she's sitting on the bed, and I got it from Seller actually in Toronto. And now the name is escaping me, but they were at Bazaar Toronto, and yeah, it's a special piece to me. But
the slip she wore in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof was actually made by the designer that made that purple peignoir set.
Awesome.
And that's how she was introduced to that designer. And from there, she would always have her film lingerie designed by Jewel Park. And so Cat on a Hot Tin Roof was a perfect example of, she found something she liked and she stuck with it and incorporated it into her life. So if you're ever in Fargo, North Dakota, I'll let you touch that.
Awesome. I love that. I love ending on that because I think it really speaks to everything that we talked about tonight. This is the type of knowledge that you can't get at the thrift store. It's the kind of knowledge that you can't get usually on Facebook Marketplace. Depends on who's selling it. That's why the prices are the prices, because of the history that's behind it, about the knowledge that you have, about the service that you provide. Exactly. And I think that was just really beautiful for you to share that. So thank you so much, Courtney. Thank you so much for tonight as well.
Thank you.
Talking to us for over 90 minutes now, 95 minutes. I don't know if the video stops at 90 minutes, so if it does, the Elizabeth Taylor anecdote is gone, but We will find out. Thank you so much to everybody who joined tonight. If you just joined us, we've been chatting for quite some time about Courtney's journey and about prices, so you'll have to go back and watch it once it's up on my page. Thank you so much, Daryl, for your questions and comments.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's lots of fun, and I hope everybody has a really great night. Thanks again. Okay, bye-bye.